Good evening and welcome to tonight's presentation. Special welcome to our local state representative, Donald Valdez, who I saw walk in. It's my delight to begin tonight's proceedings. This event marks the first of several speaker presentations commemorating Adams100, the Adams State University Centennial Celebration. Please join me in a moment of reflection as I recite the Adams State University Land Acknowledgement Statement. Nosotros, la comunidad de Adams State University, reconocemos con gratitud los pueblos indígenas en cuyas tierras ancestrales nos juntamos. We, the Adams State University community, gratefully acknowledge the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral lands we gather. Este hermoso Valle de San Luis es sagrado para diversas naciones indígenas, incluidos los Yutas, Apaches y Carías, Comanches, Kiowas, Arapahoes, Cheyennes, Navajos, pueblos y todos los otros pueblos originarios que creaban un hogar en este valle. This beautiful San Luis Valley is sacred to many indigenous nations, including the Utes, Jicarilla Apaches, Comanches, Kiowas, Arapahoes, Cheyennes, Navajos, Pueblos, and all other First Peoples who once made this valley their home. Honramos a la diversidad de comunidades que históricamente moraban aquí y a aquellos que hoy en día viven en el Valle de San Luis. We honor the diverse communities that historically dwelled here and those who currently reside in the San Luis Valley. Sabemos que honrar a las tierras es un proceso reflexivo que demanda un continuo compromiso y acción. We know that honoring these lands is a reflective process that demands continued engagement and action. Sé que recordemos siempre el viaje de los antepasados que llamaban a este valle hogar. May we always remember the journey of the past peoples who called this valley home. Before introducing Professor Rael, I'd like to thank our sponsors for making tonight's event possible. Alamosa State Bank, First Southwest Bank, San Luis Valley Federal Bank, Alamosa County, and the Adams State Office of Title V Initiatives. Their support has allowed tonight's event and others like it to take place. I also want to invite folks who are present here today to visit the alumni table that you might have walked by as you entered the room. There is a scholarship fund. There's a campaign underway, and we would support your donation to the cause. For a $100 donation, you would actually get a commemorative beer from the Del Norte Brewery, Three Barrel Brewing Company. And it has a pretty cool image on it if you haven't seen it yet. I encourage you to check it out. Please also join us on November 9th for a special conversation with Reis and Tanya Garcia. That'll be our next event as part of the Adams100 speaker series. Reis and Tanya are multi-generational members of the San Luis Valley who will be reflecting on their life as scholars, considering the valley, its history and culture. Tonight's presentation, New Ways of Building, invites us to consider how the next 100 years of Adams State University will benefit from novel and innovative approaches rooted in a firm sense of place. Professor Rael is a native son of the San Luis Valley and no easy individual to describe in a few words. I first met him a handful of years ago after hearing members of the local community praise the vision and creativity of a very humble man from Antonito. Those persons with a better sense of the local geography would be right to correct me. His connection is to La Florida, where he and his family have lived for quite some time. For the past several years, he has invited students to take part in an annual design program that runs there as part of the M12 studio. In my travels, I have seen his words proclaimed in broadsides, plastered across buildings, and heard good friends and colleagues celebrate his ambitious ideas. This past summer, I had the distinct pleasure to learn the art of plastering adobes from him alongside an army of volunteers as part of an effort to preserve the historic walls of the Lafayette head house in Conejos. In this setting, I was privileged to watch a master educator at work, someone possessing a great deal of patience and genuine enthusiasm. Professor Rael's work has been the subject of a popular TED Talk, an article in The New Yorker, and attention from the Smithsonian Institution. His semi-biographical illustrated treatise written in protest of the physical barrier built to separate the US from Mexico titled Border Wall, a manifesto for the US-Mexico boundary, was published by the University of California Press in 2017. His other publications, Earth Architecture and Printing Architecture, Innovative Recipes for 3D Printing, both with Princeton Architectural Press, explore construction with the ancient tradition of mud brick and more modern techniques like rammed and compressed earth, and new avenues for creativity in the fields of product design and modular architecture. Professor Rael obtained an undergraduate degree in environmental design from the University of Colorado Boulder and a Master of Architecture degree from Columbia University. He teaches at the University of California, Berkeley, where he holds the Eva Lai Memorial Chair in Architecture and joint appointments in the Departments of Environmental Design and Art Practice. He currently directs the Master of Architecture degree program. In addition to teaching and directing an academic degree, no small tasks, Professor Rael runs a professional practice with his partner in design and life, Virginia Sanfratello. Their firm, Rael Sanfratello, recently won the Beasley Award for 2021, one of the most prestigious international awards in design. It places them among a small coterie of the finest designers operating today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ron Rael.
Ooh, thanks. Thank you, Nick, for that really generous introduction. And I'm very honored to be here for Adams 100th anniversary. I too am an alum of this program. I attended here for 1 year during my senior year of high school. And also my father was an alum along with his brothers. One of them, who is my uncle, is sitting here in the audience. And these are also very amazing men who grew up in very humble lives, and I think were transformed, whose lives were transformed by this as a normal school that taught young men and young women in the San Luis Valley to become teachers. And so I'm honored to continue that legacy here today and be part of the speakers program. So thank you. That was a very generous introduction, and I'm going to try to tell you all about what Nick was talking about in the most expedient way. And the title of this lecture is New Ways of Building. And I wanted to talk about new ways of building in ways that we might think of building in the future, but also ways of understanding how we have built in the past, and also ways of how we are building today that might be beneficial or damaging to our ecologies or to humanity. And to think about how we can build by just looking at the things around us, and finally ways that we might be able to rebuild or build the communities, not only here in the San Luis Valley, but throughout the world. As you all know, this is a very special place in the San Luis Valley. I like to think about it as an expanded region that connects us to the borderlands, because we are in the northernmost frontier of the historic borderlands between Mexico and the United States. And we're also the headwaters of the Rio Grande, which at one time divided the east from west when Texas seceded the Union. But in a way, it splits the valley geologically and geographically. And I think we do talk about people who are on one side of the valley or the other when we think about east-west or north-south of the valley. And we recognize that the legacy of that history continues to exist in many people's language and food and building traditions. And we've seen many of these ruins, especially in the southern part of the valley, made of earth and adobe and straw. And I've always been very interested in how we build with straw. And my own house in the village of La Floria, which was built by my great-grandfather's sister's family, is built out of mud and straw and recycled from a building that was built prior to this, this one built in the early 30s. But I used that house, as Nick mentioned, as a platform where I can continue to teach building traditions, earthen plastering, the making of adobe bricks, and even traditional and indigenous foodways and customs. And I do this all here in the valley, but these ideas that have grown from the valley for me have extended out into the world in ways that have been really meaningful to me. And one of those ways is that I've continued to build these traditional mud ovens called hornos in other parts of the world. specifically along the border of the United States and Mexico, because for me, I found that building mud ovens was a way to bring communities together around the warmth of the fire and around food and around recipes and around stories. And so I was invited to build mud ovens in refugee shelters along the US-Mexico border. And it was the subject of a documentary film that I'm going to show you just a short clip of. Here's where we had sound problems earlier. What do I do in this case to put the sound? I see him frantically moving levers and buttons. No, we don't need the sound. It has a nice little soundtrack. But what's happening in this video right now is the documentary filmmakers are asking the nun who runs this shelter, what are you building here? And it's really a documentary about building this orno together as a big community. And the nun answers, what are we building? And the obvious answer might be, we're building this mud orno, but she doesn't answer that. She says, what we are building is, and she pauses for a moment and says, we are rebuilding something, and we are rebuilding humanity. We are rebuilding the spiritual and physical and psychological dimension of people who have traveled a great distance and who have been stuck in these refugee shelters because of the politics of the border, and who are about to embark on a new journey. And so it's interesting for me to think about how we don't only build buildings, but we can rebuild the connections that we have between us. I was also invited to participate in a really interesting project in Virginia called the Truth Farm. My contribution to this Truth Farm was this small little orno that's right here. I'm kind of circling it with my mouse, but it was built in Charlottesville, Virginia. And this orno I made out of adobe bricks from a WPA era schoolhouse here in Lovatos, Colorado. Cenicero, some people might know the village is named of that, was just a few miles from La Florida. And they migrated to Charlottesville, Virginia, on a site that was surrounded entirely by the winery owned by the Donald Trump family. And so it was interesting to think about the people who were working in the winery, the migration of materials, the migration of people, and then the communication of this idea of truth that could be seen from the tasting room of that winery in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the kind of food and gathering and stories that were told around that table and around that orno. As maybe many of people in this audience, I spent a lot of time growing up picking up bales of hay. And it's always been interesting to me to think of that as an act of building when we stack the bales up to make the haystacks. And so I've taken some of those ideas from my childhood of stacking hay and employed them in places like San Francisco to think how we can build art galleries made out of straw bales that are then returned back to the feedlots, the feed stores, and used as bedding for horses. But I've also worked on projects here in the San Luis Valley, and this one has been ongoing now for 13 years, in the town of Conejos, where we are building with the community of the Catholic Church there in Conejos, a labyrinth to celebrate the prayer and exercise the prayer of the Rosary. And it's an enormous project, and it was something that my creative practice designed 13 years ago, and it was in that second year explored in a smaller scale model using straw bales for the celebration, the 150th year celebration of that church in Conejos. And this is what it looked like. To give you some scale, well, I guess I can't move that little thing up there, but well, you see the size of a hay bale there on the side. So it's extremely large, and the actual one is much larger than that. And it has been, in the last 2 years, it is now being constructed by members of the community in Conejos. And one of the things that is needed to do to build this labyrinth is to manufacture, I believe it's almost 40,000 adobe bricks. And adobe, of course, has been a building material tradition in this valley for a very long time. But it has been, this task has been taken on by the octogenarian Alfonso Aveita, who has taken this task on to make all these adobes, making this probably one of the largest adobe construction sites currently in the United States. And it's also a project that's being taken on by the entire community to build this. And so we welcome you to come and visit and see the construction of this labyrinth taking place in Conejos right now, because it is truly going to be a monument. Nick mentioned that other projects are happening in Conejos as well, like the restoration of the Lafayette Head Compound and Ute Indian Agency. This is a building and compound that was built in 1854. And it was an expansive site, almost like a fort, not too dissimilar from Fort Garland in some ways, but it was a site that brought together many distinct cultures that defines the founding of the San Luis Valley and of territorial Colorado and New Mexico after the Mexican-American War. It's a site that was the Ute Indian Agency, and at that time when it was constructed in Conejos, there were 3,000 to 4,000 Utes living in Conejos. And it's also a site where an American soldier named Lafayette Head moved from Abiquiu, New Mexico, along with families from Abiquiu and Ojo Caliente to settle to Conejos on the supposition that they could gain the Conejos land grant. These families coming from Ojo Caliente and Abiquiu are more than likely descendants of Genízaro families from those villages, which were Hispanicized Native Americans who were taken into captivity, taken captive as slaves, and then eventually grew into the villages and families that exist in New Mexico and southern Colorado today. In this house, there were treaties that were drawn between the United States and the Ute, and trips from this house to Washington, D.C. to meet Abraham Lincoln. And so it's an amazing and important historic site. It's also a site where Lafayette Head himself documented indigenous slavery in Conejos and Costilla counties in the San Luis Valley. And he made these extensive lists of all of the captives that were taken in these counties by families. And as part of this project of restoring this structure, we also collaborated with the artist Chip Thomas, who is an African-American medical doctor, but who's also a world-famous paste-up graffiti artist, who placed that list on the facade of the building and on the interior of the building that describes the names and dates and ages of those captives within those two counties of Conejos and Costilla. And you can see that as well, just a short walk from the labyrinth. So what I've always found fascinating is how these expanded borderlands are places that bring people together from different customs and traditions and languages and beliefs, and how that's represented in the architecture. And we can see that just like the US-Mexico border today, the historic border was a militarized border. And there are many forts, including Fort Garland, that were built on both sides of that border at different times during that period. And they were built in a way that is hybridized. It's a hybrid of the coming together of many ideas. And in this case, in this fort, Ben's Fort in Colorado, it's made out of adobe and logs, but it's an American fort made by US soldiers in the same way that you might see a Native American pueblo in New Mexico built 1,000 years ago. And so it's interesting to me to think about this hybrid conditions, about what happens when more than one things come together: language, food, customs, cultures, beliefs. And sometimes it's funny, and sometimes it's inventive, and sometimes it's violent. And I think all those things are important to consider. And sometimes that violence remains in our history and understanding of place, just as when the governor of the state of Colorado in 1936 declared martial law in Colorado to not allow anyone from the state of New Mexico who was of indigenous or Hispanic ancestry into the state of Colorado, and dispatched Border Patrol agents to the border to check the identities of people who were entering the state. This was a martial law that was enacted for a very short time before it ended, just a day or so. But that happened. And those kind of understandings or misunderstandings continue happening today. And we saw only just a couple of years ago when the leader of the previous regime said that there was active wall construction taking place in Colorado. And it made many people wonder exactly where that wall construction was happening between Colorado and the state of New Mexico. But that kind of hybrid condition is evident in the architecture, as I mentioned. We can see buildings that have transformed over time, built in the 1700s, and see how they transform with the coming of the railroad and sawmills, and how an understanding or maybe a romanticization of history transforms those buildings as well, and how those hybrid conditions make other things in the world, like lowriders, which are kind of the interiors of those beautiful churches in New Mexico and southern Colorado that go out into the landscape, carrying culture and tradition with them as the people from these small villages went out into the world to work in mines or to come to college or work in factories in the cities. And we also can see how the demand for adobes by people in, especially in New Mexico, to build very large adobe houses because of this kind of romanticization has produced vehicles that produce 25,000 adobes a day in adobe yards in New Mexico by driving across the landscape and consuming the earth and leaving that product in its wake. And it's just an interesting phenomenon to think about buildings that were built in the 1400s and how they've transformed over time because of preservation, because of an understanding, because of ideas of how they should be cared for, in some cases dismantled. But in this really unique case of Casa Grande in Arizona, it produced this beautiful hybrid, which is this juxtaposition between a traditional indigenous building and a building made of concrete, glass, and steel. And I like to think about that as an inspiration for our own work and how we might design a future and think about new ways of building. I've started to explore that in my architectural practice, a design of a house, the first adobe house built in Marfa, Texas, probably in 100 years, that is made entirely in a traditional way with mud brick adobes and straw plastered, but also very modern and uses concrete and weaves that within the building to give it more structural support and to kind of define the way that electricity and plumbing is placed in the building. It's also a way of thinking about the future of archaeology. The bricks you see on the bottom were manufactured in Albuquerque, New Mexico. They are much stronger. They cost more. The buildings above the lintel of the door are lighter in color. They were manufactured in Ojinaga, Mexico, and they're not as strong, so they are higher, but they're much less expensive. And so there's an economy in that building. There is a history in that building. There's a geology in that building. And it's interesting to think about these new ways of building as recognizing the impact that one has when they're making things in the environment. When we were making that particular building, we were invited to make a building that not only includes economy and geology, but also a political dimension. And this is a project called Prada Marfa that in many ways blurs the borders between art and architecture. It's a project that speaks to the juxtaposition between wealth and poverty, between Mexican and American, along the US-Mexico border, sort of pretending to be a store that sells high-end shoes and purses like you might find in Milan, Italy, but in a landscape where the traditional shoe was made out of yucca fiber, like this. But it's also a landscape where people walk hundreds of miles until their own shoes wear out and they have to stuff yucca fiber in their shoes to keep on going. And so this building, which was based on this very famous photograph called Prada by Andreas Gertzky, looks like a store. You can't go in it. It holds the 2004 line of shoes and purses from Prada, and it's in the middle of the Chihuahuan desert. And so if you happen to drive by this, it's illuminated and it feels some ways like an immigrant, and sometimes it's reacted to like an immigrant. It's blasphemized or it's attacked in some ways, and sometimes it's accepted and nurtured. But it's a project that also thinks about its future archaeology and makes references to the past as well. We built the building so that every adobe brick is cast in cement mortar, like the military buildings that were built after the Mexican-American War in Texas, that today are beginning to erode because an adobe doesn't do well when it sits in cement mortar. But it's also become a cultural icon. And what does it mean to think about buildings that become cultural objects? And this one became a particularly cultural object when Beyonce jumped in front of it and posted it to her Instagram account. And now everyone who visits it jumps in front of the building like this. And to think about the fact that even the Simpson family went on a road trip and stopped by Prada Marfa, and they weren't so interested in the art necessarily, but I know that Homer needed to go behind there and use the restroom. While we were building this building, we would see helicopters and Border Patrol agents pick up people walking in that desert. And after 9/11, we began to see continued border security along the US-Mexico border because there was a notion that there was no longer a war on drugs, but now a war on terror, and Mexico had something to do with it. And so that unleashed the 2006 Secure Fence Act, which demanded the construction of 800 miles of wall along that US-Mexico border. This was a law put into action by George W. Bush and has continued since that time. And so when the leader of the previous regime announced that he is running on a platform to build a wall, in fact, there was already a law passed to build 800 miles of wall, 90% of which had already been constructed by the time he came into office, at a cost of $3.4 billion since 2006. And to complete that project, it would require $49 billion to finish and maintain it over the next 25 years. This already exists. This already has happened. We've already paid for this. This is not the proposed $70 billion by the previous regime leader to construct walls, of which only 3 miles were constructed. But it calls into question what we do with our collective money, what we build with our collective taxpayer money, and what can we build for $49 billion? For example, we could build 300 Seattle public libraries. We could build 204 Disney concert halls. We could build 500 miles of the High Line. Remember that I said there are 800 miles of border wall that were constructed. You could build 500 miles of park or library or cultural amenities or social amenities along the US-Mexico border or elsewhere in this country at the cost that it took to build the wall that was voted for by and enacted by both the population and legislatures of all parties, in fact. Nick mentioned this book, Border Wall as Architecture, and I wondered if the wall is in fact architecture. And what does it mean for it to be architecture? Then it needs to be designed. And who designed that wall? It was designed by an organization called Fence Lab in conjunction with Texas A&M University. And one of the ways they tested the impermeability of the wall designs that they would make is they would load a vehicle with 40,000 pounds and ram it into the wall at 50 miles an hour to demonstrate how strong these walls were, and at a cost of millions of dollars to make these tests. And like with all research, especially research related to what I would say militarization research, there is counter research that takes place. And this is the research that's been taking place in Mexico. Portable drawbridges that can be just brought up to the wall so that vehicles can drive right over those border walls. And sometimes really in really fantastic ways. And sometimes these research experiments work and sometimes they don't. And there's something very both ridiculous and dramatic about this and even funny. But what's not so funny is that the construction of the wall has pushed people to further extremes in the desert. And since 1994, more than 6,000 people have died trying to cross the border because they're pushed to greater extremes in the desert. And over 30 laws were waived for the construction of the wall. This is Native American Heritage Acts, Environmental Protection Acts, Wilderness Acts. The Secure Fence Act of 2006 became the highest law in the land, and nothing, in fact, could stop it or did stop it. It was proposed through university campuses. But if we zoom into that wall, we find that the wall has in fact not repelled people or kept people away, but it has even brought people together in some really interesting and remarkable ways to celebrate the binational heritage that is separated by that wall. There are binational yoga classes that take place along that wall. And I liked this particular photograph from National Geographic from the early 1900s, which is entirely staged, by the way. But it's a photograph of Border Patrol agents pulling someone into the United States, presumably to arrest them, and his friends in Mexico pulling him back to Mexico so he doesn't get arrested. And it brings up what I think is another dichotomy of the border, having two sides. And one side is about the horror of poverty and xenophobia and racism and the trials and tribulations that immigrants face today. And then it's also about humor, the ridiculousness of many of the things that are happening at the border, but humor as a way to overcome those challenges of the horror. And as I documented stories that were taking place along the border for the last, I guess, 20 years, I began to illustrate these stories and build models of these stories that are part of this book, Border Walls Architecture, so that we can remember the time that a wall was constructed in the United States, but also to recall the time that well, to recall what a ridiculous idea that was in the future, and maybe we wouldn't do it again, and to think about the past border that existed prior to that border. And so I collected stories about Border Patrol agents buying food from a vendor across money exchange, food exchange, entirely illegal, made illegal by just a couple of centimeters of steel, and made small models just to remember those moments of trading food and stories across the divide, of ideas of using the border wall as an armature for movement of people within cities, since it's kind of a barrier of movement for people, bicycle and pedestrian paths. Binational libraries where the wall is nothing more than a bookshelf. Seeing the border as a kind of political theater, imagining a theater in which the stage and the screen are split by the wall itself, and audiences and performers are on both sides. Swings attached to the border wall that allow people to journey over to another country before gravity deports them back to their own country. And so this wall is there, and this is what it looks like on one side. On one side, someone's just mowing their lawn in their backyard. And another side, that wall is the fourth wall of someone's house. Because the wall doesn't only divide countries, nations, it divides cities, it divides communities, and it divides families from each other. And we created a series of blueprints of houses that show the typical size of a house in El Paso, Texas on the right, and the typical size of a house in Juarez, Mexico on the left. And in this case, the wall divides the bed in the bedroom. And those are the subjects of this book, Border Walls Architecture. Those are the stories that are told. And when I was wrapping up, when I started that book, I was wrapping up a different kind of book. And it was related in some ways because it was related to here, where we are tonight, the San Luis Valley, in terms of thinking about the borderlands and thinking about the materials for building in the borderlands, but also this Egyptian architect who built in adobe, not only in his homeland of Egypt, but also in this borderland region in New Mexico. He was the designer and builder of the mosque in Abaku. But he had a quote that's attributed to him that I thought worked very well with the book, which the book was about the fact that he says architects do not design walls, but the spaces between them. And I think it very important as a designer, as an architect, to think about the spaces that are affected or endangered by the construction of walls or anything that we build today. So I was finishing a book called Earth Architecture, which kind of focuses on my interest in adobe and rammed earth and cob. And in the final chapter of that book, I wondered what the future of earth architecture might be. And at that time, I thought maybe it's 3D printing, because 3D printing was kind of, it wasn't so new in 2006, but it was something that seemed to be possible to 3D print something like Adobe, something like mud. And I started a project called Emerging Objects, because I liked the idea that objects, cultural objects, could emerge from a technology in a way that hadn't been done before. And around that same time, there was a publication in its anniversary that announced the 40 things you need to know about the next 40 years. And the number one thing that they said we need to know about the next 40 years is that sophisticated buildings will be made out of mud. An amazing kind of announcement from Smithsonian Magazine. And I thought, wow, that's really great for people who are interested in mud building, who have come from those traditions, that the future is actually in our own building traditions. But I also thought it interesting to think about the fact that the number one thing we need to know about the last 10,000 years is that sophisticated buildings were made out of mud. You know, it's only recently that we started building things out of concrete and steel and glass. And we can look back to here in this particular landscape, just a previous generation, and maybe some of you today live in buildings made out of mud. That's what civilization said. So this project, Emerging Objects, looked at clay and how we can take a 30,000-year-old tradition of using mud and shaping it, and use 3D printers to reshape that mud and think about what we can do with it. And so we invented a number of 3D printable materials made out of clay and tested them. It took us into the realm of ceramics and make bricks, weird bricks that might hold plants or water or insulation or might store water like a sponge and become kind of a swamp cooler effect, but also a building wall. And we also began to explore robots and how robots placed mud in the landscape, placed mud in a way that maybe you couldn't do with your hand to make objects that looked like this or like that. Not knowing what that's good for, but excited about the possibility that you could place mud in different ways that hadn't been placed in the last 10,000 years. And we really pushed this technology just as a kind of form of science and art where we're thinking about the mathematics of the movement of a robot and the squeezing out of clay and the kinds of shapes and forms that were made possible by that technology. And it took us on a journey of making things out of clay that became really fantastic. But remembering that I was an architect, wondering what this might be good for, and imagining the possibility that maybe we could build buildings this way, or maybe we could build parts of buildings this way. Maybe we could build buildings that had these kinds of amazing textures and openings, and maybe we could build surfaces and tiles and building blocks that had these kind of surfaces and textures. It also took us on a journey of thinking about, in the same way that we can look at the dirt outside and say we could build a brick out of that and make a building out of that, what other building materials are outside? And in the San Francisco Bay Area where I live, salt is one of those materials. In the southern part of the San Francisco Bay, there are crystallization plants that produce thousands of tons of salt a year using only sun and wind by drying out these crystallization ponds. And we developed a series of materials made primarily out of salt that were shaped by a robot. And because salt is very inexpensive, we began to imagine what we could do with that to build something out of salt. And we imagined taking that landscape and making buildings out of it, thinking about how Native Americans used snow to make an igloo, for example, or here in the valley, you make mud and make a building out of it. We embarked on a project called the Salt Igloo because it was made out of salt igloo. I thought that joke might work okay here. But it's made out of salt blocks or salt tiles. It's much more like a salt tent that we were trying to make, a really lightweight tent made out of salt. And we worked to make this material waterproof and lightweight and held in tension. That's it in construction. And just thinking about the possibility of the material, its translucency, how beautiful it is. And that just took us in a direction of thinking about, can we use sawdust? And we developed materials made out of sawdust. That's now part of a company we founded called Forest that takes sawdust and makes building products out of. We can make walls, screens, facades, furniture. If you want to build, it's forest.com. We spelled forest wrong. It's UST. That's how we spell it. Because forests are for us and not for the landfill. Experiments in cement, where we're not using large amounts of water. We're not using any formwork, but we're shaping the cement materials from the powder. And we can make complex objects without any molds or without any forms. We can make furniture. We can make spaces. These are some of the larger things that we've produced. And in all these complex textures and surfaces, we're always thinking about the traditions that allowed us to get here in the first place. The beautiful kind of traditions of earth and building that exist not only here in the valley, but all over the world. So these kind of environments that we're making and these kind of experiments, we at a certain point did not know where they would go, but they've taken shape in many different ways. And one way is in the rebuilding of coral reefs around the world. Those wiggly little clay structures that I showed you were something that scientists saw when they visited our studio and saw that we could print many materials and asked us to print coral that was scanned from the ocean out of calcium carbonate, which is what coral produce, not to restore coral reefs, but just to demonstrate the scanning technology, and that higher pH levels in the ocean actually degrade calcium carbonate. But when they saw those curly wavy things, they said those are ideal habitat for coral larvae. And so we worked with scientists from the Academy of Sciences to produce a series of ceramic designs that would be ideal habitat for coral. And we produced over 4,000 of these ceramic objects of various shapes and sizes that can tumble in the ocean, that can be dumped off a boat, that can be anchored to the bottom. But in these little crevices and nubs, small, tiny coral larvae can take root and grow and thrive and reestablish coral reefs in a way that's pretty inventive and ingenious. And it's being tested now all over the world with a great deal of success. So we're excited about the possibility that they hope that we produce 1 million of these in the next phase to test them again all over the world. So it's not only rebuilding environments for animals and habitat, but how can we use some of this technology to think about rebuilding habitat for humanity, for ourselves? And this is a project called Cabin of 3D Printed Curiosities that took advantage of the housing crisis in the San Francisco Bay Area. And you may have heard about the homeless crisis in my region in California. And because of that, the city has relaxed the zoning requirements where you do not need an architect and you do not need to go before the planning board to build a up to 1,200 square foot building in your backyard. And so we explored the way we might build a building in the backyard using 3D printing. 4,000 ceramic tiles that are 3D printed, using this technology by robots hung from a 3D printed armature. Every tile looks slightly different, even though in the computer it's the same, but because of this kind of wiggle, it looks really homemade and kind of natural. The front facade of the building is made out of recycled sawdust, cement, salt, and in some cases, Chardonnay grape skins that are leftover agricultural waste product from the wineries in Napa and Sonoma Valleys, each holding plants that grow and thrive in the Northern California climate. And the building itself has taken on its own ecology and has become very much part of the environment itself. And this is what the Cabin of Curiosity looks like. Even the furniture are things that we began to print. The translucency of 3D printed bioplastic made of corn allows the interior to be illuminated and becomes a light itself that we can temper and transform the quality of that space and how you would feel with it related to light. And it takes on a tradition that you may have seen here of pressed tin panels, but in this case, every panel is different and not replicated, creating these surfaces. And we even have, I think we have some coffee cups made out of coffee on the 3D printed coffee table. And so these are kind of experiments that are new ways of building in landscapes that demand new ways of thinking about building, thinking about ways of housing and who is housed and how one can be housed, and kind of efficiencies of space that transform a small space into a place to live and sleep. I'm going through the slides a little bit slow because my computer's bogged down for some reason. These, 3D printing things and buildings made of mud seem really different from each other. But in my mind, they come from the same place, and they come from here. They come from the San Luis Valley. And many people are asking, like, can you connect those two somehow? And so I thought, well, maybe my interest also in border, could we make this research borderless? Could we combine ideas of the borderlands, ideas of building in earth, ideas of building in 3D printing? And that's allowed for some really interesting innovations. One is someone we call the Hakal Digital, I guess we call it, the digital Hakal. A Hakal is a building in some of the earliest buildings in San Luis Valley that were made of poles covered in mud. And in this case, we're taking that bioplastic that's made out of corn and creating patterns and a web like wattle and daub to attach mud to it. And so it's simply plastered in a way, using the community comes together, we're using local soils, in this case in France, and creating a structure that demands the kind of the wattle part, which is the 3D printed part, and the daub part to give it its ultimate rigidity and strength and beauty. And this is what the final experiment looked like. Other ways we're combining this is this small project called Bad Hombres. And I don't know if you remember, many years ago, I was actually in El Paso, Texas, and the regime leader said, there are some bad hombres at the border. And I thought, I'm at the border, but that's interesting. What's a bad hombre? He didn't say they're bad hombres at the border. He said they're bad hombres. And hombres in the art world, because I'm an artist, I guess, are this gradation between light and dark. And I guess in the world of hairstyles, I think one of these is a bad hombre and one is a good hombre, but it's this mixture of many things. And that's what the border is about. It's the mixture of different cultures and ideas, and in this case, colors. And so we took clay from California and clay from Georgia. They had very different, of course, kind of cultures, but also geologies, and demonstrated how a single object might have all these different flavors and scales of material, and you can understand its whole and you can understand its part. We're really fortunate this group collection is now part of the Smithsonian permanent collection at the Kraft Smithsonian Museum of the Renwick. But that idea of bringing things together might be reinforced by an idea of taking clay from Mexico and clay from the United States and making objects. And so it also opened up the idea that we would dig that dirt ourselves and not buy those clays from clay shops. And so we went out to University of Texas, El Paso. We invited 25 ceramic artists from Juarez and El Paso to walk around with us and dig clay. And we found all these amazing complexions of clay, from whites to browns, tans, even green in one case. And we developed a software that anyone could use that was what we were using to make these objects. And so ceramic potters who did not know anything about using a 3D printer or modeling in a computer could now make really complex, crazy, weird objects. And we now sell this software to universities and high schools all over the world so that students can learn 3D printing really easily. But those 25 ceramic artists from the two countries made 270 of these beautiful ceramic vessels from the material of their cities and region and landscape. And it also pushed us to think about how we might print much bigger, because the idea was, from the beginning, was this: how can we print much larger structures, walls, maybe spaces, maybe buildings themselves? Because this was the idea. Could we do this? And one thing that we didn't know how to do is make a machine. So I imagined a machine, a very simple machine that rotated around itself and could deposit adobe. And I sent it off to a company that I had been working with who manufactures machines, and they decided that they would like to try to make it with us and commercialize it. And this was the outcome of it. Is a weird kind of homemade robot called 3D Potter, and it can make lots of vessels, lots of ceramic objects, but it can also make big objects. And if we can make it even bigger, maybe we can make something like a room, or maybe we can make something like a building. The other thing we had to do is figure out how we can squeeze lots of adobe through a hose in order to print. So this is a human 3D printer here, and we're testing how we can squeeze adobe through a hose and attach it to a robot. And we got better and better over the years, to the extent that we became confident enough to bring it here to the San Luis Valley and test in a remote environment where we could test the frontier of construction by thinking about mud, not only as a material, but as something that responded to mobility and the ubiquity of the material and the democracy of it that allows anyone to build with it. And so the first time in the history of the planet, a robot is building adobe, and it's happening here in the San Luis Valley. And these kind of experiments that we're doing just east of Antonito are experiments that are looking at the past and looking at the future and thinking about how we can make staircases, how we can make pottery, how we can make rooms, how we can make different kinds of structures that look at the future and learn from the past. And I'm just going to take you on a quick little walk of what became my design studio during COVID. It became, my studio became, my mother's backyard became my studio. And we're just digging dirt from the field with the front end loader, mixing it with straw, running it through the machine and making these tests. The video is a little bit laggy, but there are tests about texture and surface and construction and ways of making openings and ways of making domes and spaces and thinking about how we can move faster with building. So in this case, we made this rail on which we could move the robot along, and we could, so if anyone's built with Adobe, you have to let it dry. And so in this case, we could print a certain amount and move the robot, let it dry, move it, and by the time we come back, it's already dried and we can keep building. And we can continue that construction kind of nonstop, using the materials right at our feet. I think we use $16 worth of materials for this particular structure that we control with the cell phone, that one person can carry. And because we built it during the time of COVID, we called this structure Casa Covida. Everybody knows what casa means. And Covida means cohabitation, living together, building a place where people can live together during the time of COVID, two people. And this is Casa Covida. It's a 3-room space, very experimental, right? It doesn't quite have a room. Everything's homemade. I collected aluminum cans alongside of the road and melted them down and poured them into a 3D print to make the door handles. Beetle kill pine for the doors and the lintels. Friends from New Mexico who shear churro sheep wove the textiles inside the space for sleeping. A fireplace for cooking, the pottery made out of micaceous New Mexico clay, where you can cook in that pottery itself right over fire without it cracking or breaking. It has been done for thousands of years in this region. And a place for bathing and looking at the sky and the stars, filling water from our aquifer and heating it. Sunflowers that grow in the field. And what about a roof? Everybody wants a roof. What about a hybrid roof? A roof that's inflatable, that transforms the spaces in the interior in ways that we may not have expected before, casting this pink color, a kind of cherry on top. It'd be inflated and deflated. This technology we've started to, in a really ironic way, explore at the renovation of the Frontier Drive-In near Center, Colorado. If we're thinking about new frontiers of building in the historic frontier, what a better place to do it than at the Frontier Drive-In, which is now under construction. And they've invited us to build a space for looking at the stars and looking at the sky and bathing in warm waters. And so we're building and we're going to begin this, we've already begun, but we're going to continue in May because now it's too cold. The largest 3D printed earthen structure that's also permitted and engineered in the world, and it's happening in Center. So please come to learn about the Frontier Drive-In and the amazing programming and films and places to understand the valley and the borderlands in more beautiful ways. During all these experiments, we're out here in the San Luis Valley and we feel like we're very far away, but friends back home and friends along the border are experiencing something tragic, which is the separation of children from their families. And so many friends were attending protests, and we thought we would design a sign, a protest sign that friends could download and use in protest. And I began to think about this particular sign, which is pretty iconic in California. Maybe you've seen it, but it warns motorists that migrants might be dropped off alongside the road by human traffickers and might attempt to run across the road, so we have to be careful not to hit them. The designer of this sign has a really interesting story that's related to the borderlands and related to this region. The designer, John Hood, was a New Mexican. He was a Navajo, and he was also a war veteran. And he worked for the California Department of Transportation as a graphic designer. And when he designed the original sign, he thought very carefully about what this sign communicated, because he saw the plight of the immigrant today as similar to that of the long walk of the Navajo when they were displaced from their lands. He used a little girl with pigtails because he thought that's who drivers might empathize with the most. And he used the head of the silhouette of the civil rights leader Cesar Chavez as the head for the father. And I made one simple move in thinking about how this can tell the story of reuniting families at the border, which was to turn the families to face each other and say reunite instead of caution. And I made this an open source file where anyone could download it on the internet, shared it through social media. People started downloading it, using it in protest, but it caught the eye of an organization that wanted to bring this sign back to the highway in a way that I would have never imagined before. And it was taken up by the For Freedoms campaign, which is the largest public art initiative in the world. And it was made in the form of an enormous billboard where hundreds of thousands of people saw this sign to tell the story of the relationships that we should actually be rebuilding, and the idea that we should possibly be rebuilding a reunited states and not a divided states. That sign can also be seen at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine today in Manhattan. And artists continue to download it, and this one guy is installing them in Los Angeles on street signs. And it's also seen as an art project, and it's been on museums. And it's interesting to think about how, in this case, something that maybe I wouldn't have considered art, but maybe is both art and a form of activism. And at the moment it becomes the facade of a building, it even has deeper implications, because there's the idea that maybe you can smuggle forms of activism into places where those kind of ideas aren't typically spoken about. And this idea of smuggling design to places was the topic of another illustration that we made for the book Border Walls Architecture called Teeter-Totter Wall. And it was a story or an illustration that just imagined the border as a metaphorical fulcrum between US and Mexico relationships, and the equities and inequities, the imbalance or balance between poverty and wealth, between labor and trade. And this was the illustration that was made in 2010. And this was the model called Teeter-Totter Wall that was made. And these particular drawings and models from that book caught a lot of attention. And in some cases, we were invited to see if it was possible to actually make this. And we were invited by arts organizations along the border and worked with communities and cities and the Department of Homeland Security and Border Patrol to see if something like this could ever be possible. And the Department of Homeland Security and Border Patrol always said, absolutely not, never. But because we build things in the world and like to think about new ways of building, we wondered, what would it mean to actually build something like this? Like an architect thinks about the soil when they're making a foundation, or the climate when they're thinking about the amount of insulation in the wall. What are the issues that we would have to consider when building a teeter-totter on the wall? How would it slip through? How would you add the seats and the handlebars? What are the dimensions of it? We even measured how long it would take for Border Patrol to arrive if we were carrying a large object to the wall from the United States or from Mexico. And we had all those numbers, about 8 or so minutes on the US side, even faster on the Mexican side, the US Border Patrol would come. And because we had all that information and data and measurements, we decided to work with friends in Juarez to make the teeter-totter, to build it as designed. This is the first ride of the teeter-totter. We worked with community members there, a collective that makes housing for the poor in Juarez called Colectivo Chopeque. And we talked about how we might smuggle this to the wall and what that would mean and what communities would come to the wall. And this is no longer metaphorical fulcrum, but now this is the literal fulcrum, potentially for US-Mexico relations and the way it's attached to the steel wall. And we thought a lot about the color of it. It was interesting to us that we could take the same material that the wall was made of, a tube of steel, and turn it in another direction, and it could not become a barrier anymore, but become a bridge. And what did it mean to use that same material to connect people rather than to divide people? And would we change its color and perhaps change its meaning. We thought about a lot of colors that would stand apart, like bright orange or white. And we ultimately decided collectively that we would paint it bright pink, because we would remember that even though this was a piece of playground equipment and this was an act of play, that this was also a site of violence. And in Juarez, anytime you see a pink cross, it remembers the women that were killed during the time of violence when Juarez was the most violent city in the world. We never plan to install it, but with the continued conversation about more wall construction and the separation of more children from their families, we simply woke up one day and got together with communities and families in Juarez and El Paso, and we took those objects to the wall. And this is how it went down. I wish there was sound, but I think there's not. No. Well, I'll just narrate what you're seeing. I mean, I was very afraid. I was afraid not only for myself, but I was afraid mostly for the people on the US side. I was very nervous and anxious. But the moment I stuck that teeter-totter to the fence, there was already a child on it, laughing and playing. We didn't ask permission to do this. Within 8 minutes, Border Patrol did show up, as expected. They asked what we were doing, and we said we were having an event with families. And they pulled over to the side and said, "Thanks for letting us know." And they smiled and watched. Unexpectedly, the Mexican National Guard arrived, heavily armed. And they asked us what we were doing. And the mothers on the Mexican side said, "None of your business. We're just having fun with our kids. Go away." And so they stood aside really respectfully, and they took some pictures and smiled. We invited both Border Patrol and Mexican National Guard if they wanted to participate, and they thought it wouldn't be very professional of them if they did. But what I learned from that is how the mothers and children who participated in that event that day defined that space. They own that space. That was their space. It was public space. And the wall, in fact, the border is public space. And if it's public space, maybe we can decide what to do with it. We could decide if these are sites of violence or sites of connection. And while we thought this was a humble event that happened only for 40 minutes until the children actually got tired of riding on a seesaw just like they do in any playground, we had the opportunity to tell a different story of the borderlands. A story not where bad hombres are doing bad things and where no one lives, but a place where mothers and children and grandmothers live, and they experience joy despite the oppression of the wall. And we're able to show the world that just like on a teeter-totter, the actions that take place on one side of that teeter-totter have a consequence on the other. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks. All right. Let's sit down, thanks. I think we have some questions maybe.
There's a microphone.
I'm happy to feel very free to ask me any kind of question. We can be very open and honest together.
All right, thank you. That was amazing. And I think what really brought significance with me is the word significant buildings. My husband and I have been in the construction company for a bunch of years, and we built the capilla up in San Luis. So when you talk about significance, about a legacy, about a crown gem or crown jewel, that's ours. And I just applaud you. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wondered about the the facilities, you had the tub where the lady was soaking, but what about actual facilities to go when you need to go?
The bathroom you're talking about. Where's the bathroom? That's coming next. We're gonna print a commune. Does anyone know what a commune is? That's what we're gonna print next. Yeah, it's all part of an experiment. I mean, I'm not claiming this project is over. It's really the making of walls in a new way. And I think we have to start thinking about how we make all the other parts of a building. And do we use the technology or not? Can we use it? I don't know, but things like plumbing and heating, and it's just a different way in this case of talking about not only the way we might live in the future, but the way we lived in the past. Yeah. Thank you. I grew up in the San Luis Valley. I grew up in a little village called La Florida, east of Antonito, where my family's lived now for 7 generations. Thank you. I appreciate that. I think, I've been to many places in the world, and I'm always so, sometimes I think I have the deepest conversations and the most interesting ideas shared with me by the people from here, because their experiences are so unique. And for me, it's been an amazing place to draw inspiration from. And that's one reason I keep coming back. And probably will always. I don't think I've ever left, actually. That's the way I look at it. I think I go places to do things, to work or to go to school, but I come back home to be here.
The home construction with the 3D printing was interesting. Could something like that be combined with the slip form concrete to make stuff even bigger, maybe?
There are people who are using a form of concrete and 3D printers to make buildings, and that's moving quite rapidly. I think there's a lot of companies now that have been formed doing that. So yes, I think the answer I have is yes. I take a different position because, and it's a position that has to do with the economy of concrete and the ecology of concrete. I think, and preserving traditions. And maybe I think we can look at maybe my own history, or many people in this room's histories, and to think about the way they might have built 1,000 years ago in this region. And then how different moments in history that technology changed. So for example, after colonialization, well, before colonialization, mud was used and shaped by hand and built multi-story structures like Taos Pueblo, which we know very well. After, the adobe brick was introduced in this region. And that changed the way that the building was made. And maybe a 3D printer might be another way to think about building. But I think you're right that the 3D printer gives rise to questions about, well, what other materials like concrete, or what other things like plumbing could it accommodate? Yeah.
Ron, thank you so much. I was wondering if you could tell us more about your vision for the Lafayette Head House, that compound, the project in that area, because that's such a deep historical roots there, but also it's coming to life in new ways with your project there.
So the slide that I showed you of that image with the artwork on the facade of that building isn't the only building on the Lafayette Head House. There is actually another much larger building there. And so I would say maybe 1/8 of that original structure exists. And I was interested in telling the story, the history of that place, because it's so important, having to do with indigenous histories, post-Mexican American War histories, Anglo histories, US histories, Mexican histories, and what's really a complex history about the overlapping of all these participants in making that space. So I want to tell that story. And it is now under nomination to the National Trust of Historic Places. And also it was voted as Colorado's most endangered site for 2020. I'd like to think that I'd like to continue thinking about it in terms of historic preservation, but also think about how art and design might be alternative ways to tell those stories. And so involving artists like Chip Thomas, involving community members coming together to do work on the project and learn about the project, involving academics, the local community. To me, that's exciting, that it becomes a place where we can rebuild history and rebuild a community while we're rebuilding a building. All right, right in this building, the clothing of Lafayette Head is in the Luther Bead Museum, and photographs of the house and the lavish interiors are housed in the museum. And so if you get a chance, go up and see them because they're amazing. Yeah. Is there an Adobe in the museum? We should put an Adobe in the museum. Yeah, definitely. Okay. Yeah, okay. So you're talking about a brick. You want a house. Okay.
So we have a question from online, and that is, what are the insulative properties of salt bricks? And also a second question, how do you heat the bath at Casa Covida?
Okay, I'll start with the second question. How do you heat the bath at Casa Covida? I actually have a portable propane hot water system that's kind of concealed that circulates hot water into that bath. So it's, it's not, so it's kind of easy. Sorry to blow that fantasy of my beautiful friend floating in the sunflowers, but yeah, there's just some pipes in there. Oh, and the insulative properties of salt. Well, it depends on the thickness and how much air. I don't know enough about that, but I know enough about building materials to say that sometimes a building material or a building material system isn't based on a single material. And in the case of Adobe, it can be. And Adobe isn't very insulative, but it works really well because it's a mass and it can hold heat. And so while I don't know about the insulative properties of salt, I can certainly imagine ways that you can add other materials like insulation to it to make a building system rather than a monolithic system.
So maybe a couple more questions.
Yes. There's perlite mines and red soil south of Antonito. Have you tried to make a blend with adobe with those?
Yeah, not yet. I think about it all the time because I live right down the road from the pumice packing plant there. And so every time I see it, I think about, because pumice is really insulative. It's full of air pockets, like insulation. And to think about using that mixed with adobe. There was, one of the earliest written documents on adobe was written by this guy Vitruvius, who was a Roman historian. And he wrote about an adobe that could float because it was made out of pumice. That's all I got about that.
And I'd also like to just say, I'm so proud of you.
Thank you.
I did medicine in Antonito for a long time and took care of the Rael family.
Yeah.
And extremely proud of your whole family.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
One more question.
This kind of piggybacks onto what Kathleen asked. Your roots are clearly in the San Luis Valley, but you've also done some amazing things. What do you feel like it was in your childhood that you drew up, the nutrients that you drew up from these roots here, that allowed you to flourish the way that you have? Sorry if I put you on the spot.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I can tell you that I think I had a pretty special childhood. Not an easy childhood necessarily, but a special childhood. It was a childhood full of hard work. I had grandparents who were very poor, and subsequently, of course, their children were poor also. I mentioned that many of them came to this school. I think education was a big part of it, and being exposed to education early on, and kind of a work ethic. And also, I'm probably interested a lot in looking at the past and respecting the past and looking at the future, because my grandparents didn't have electricity and they didn't have plumbing, and they butchered sheep and they grew gardens. And my grandparents on the other side were very hard work, built the railroad, worked on the railroad. And I think seeing those things is very formative. I'll say that with a lot of honesty, I probably went away to college, so I didn't have to chop wood and feed cows in the snow anymore. You know, I could say I joined sports, so I didn't have to go home and do chores. And those were all experiences also that led to all this. Yeah. All right. Well,
Wow, amazing. Ron, thank you so much. Please give him another round of applause.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight.
Yeah, and yes, definitely. Thank you all for coming. What a great kickoff to our Adams100 speaker series. We want to make sure the people in the community, people on our campus feel comfortable coming to our future events that we'll have all the way through spring of 2022, because we're going to milk this 100 as long as we can. But what a great contribution to the beginning of the speaker series and celebrating our centennial, and actually making a place where our community and our campus can come together to learn and to think about our futures together. And Ron, just stupendous. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.